Hey everybody. Okay, so we get back to our a slightly more usual unit for us after our time to survey the landscape for our midterm essay there. So Unit 9, we get into the next literary period, moving out of the Romantic period and now into the Victorian period. Another really good example of where we talk about it as a literary period, but its bounding timeline is entirely non-literary. It's simply the reign of Queen Victoria in England. So just another good reminder of how, in some cases, arbitrary or sort of external those kinds of dating things are for our literary eras. But we do move into a period where we do want to identify some kind of new or different, maybe, shifts in focus than what we had seen during the Romantic period. In fact, oftentimes what you begin to see, and this is very simplistic, but in a very general sense, it's a sort of pendulum swinging from one opposing view to another, or one kind of focus on one aspect to its opposite, and then back to the thing itself, and then back to its opposite. So if the era preceding the Romantic period tended to focus more on the intellect or the power of reason over imagination, what we see in the Romantic period is really uprising more of imagination as opposed to that strict intellectualizing or reasoning capability. Of course, when we get into the Victorian period, and again, very generally speaking, we see sort of a reemergence of that emphasis on reason. In fact, one of the authors that we read here, Matthew Arnold, he used the phrase right reason to describe the faculty that he understood that everybody had, and that really enabled us to be making good decisions about ideas that were good or bad, or decisions about our moral or ethical behavior that were either good or bad. So we had this faculty of reason that we should be depending on. So that really harkens him back to somebody like certainly Milton, but even think about Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, arguing that in terms of gender equality, it just made sense if we appealed to our reasonable sort of decision-making faculties that people should be treated equally. So again, that pendulum sort of swings back and forth a little bit. The overarching idea that we'll really try to take away from our study of the Victorian period here is that there's not one single kind of cultural or social or historical change that really occupies people's attention. And if there was in the Romantic period, again, a simplification, it's probably the presence of like physical rebellion and revolution in the world, and that had such a profound effect, particularly on those early Romantics. It was just one of those dominating focuses. The Victorian period really sees such a diversity of social concerns and particular kinds of change to the literal physical landscape, but also just to people's sort of social world that they're a part of, that it's really not just one of those cultural changes or social shifts that matters. It's simply the pace of change itself that becomes so consuming for so many thinkers and writers and various kinds of philosophers and artists generally. So it's not one change, it's simply the pace of change. And that might really be an interesting way of characterizing our own age, whether there's one kind of overriding concern that just comes back and back and back. If you were to identify it, it might be something like global relations, or even that very Victorian concern of imperialism. But for the most part, I think people might agree that what characterizes our age, particularly because we're in the information, the digital age here, is simply the speed at which things happen, at which information travels, at which change can happen. And now maybe the difference for us versus that Victorian concern with pace of change is that how quickly evidence of that change can be communicated. So someone with a cell phone halfway around the world records video, is able to get that uploaded, and all of a sudden that becomes worldwide within minutes, hours, maybe days at the most. So again, it's the pace of information that has really characterized our age, I think. But we do see in the Victorian era, certainly more so maybe than the Romantic period, some of the seeds that really characterize our modern world as far as it being mechanized and industrialized and certainly urbanized. So the center of population shifts even more than previously to cities as opposed to the countryside. So one of the authors that we'll begin looking at here is Matthew Arnold. And I have you reading two of his works, although I've always been struck that if you didn't know it was the same author, you would be really hard-pressed to say this is the same guy writing. So there's a poem called Dover Beach, which is really kind of sort of emotional as opposed to intellectual, if we can make that distinction. But then his very famous essay, we're reading from Culture and Anarchy, and in fact that essay and even the title, slightly reworded, becomes again a really good sort of key term that we can take away from one of the central Victorian preoccupations. So the title of Arnold's work is actually Culture and Anarchy, but a good rewriting of that would be Culture or Anarchy. In other words, we have these two very distinct possibilities. So for Arnold, culture meant an educated populace that was capable of both having personal liberty, which is what we prize so much today, being able to do as one likes, he calls it, but having the sense, the right reason, to always be making decisions about our actions based on notions of sort of the social good, as opposed to just because I have the liberty to do this thing, I am going to do it, and that's where the discussion ends. So those two possibilities, just doing as one likes, leads to the potential for, in Arnold's argument, anarchy. The opposite then is to have an educated, literate populace, and from that we derive the sense of culture or sweetness and light, or the best that hath been thought and said in the world. All these great phrases that he uses to describe these two possibilities. So that again really lays out fairly clearly one of the central and overriding concerns for the Victorian period is, again, given the pace of change and this kind of degree to which things are changing on the social scene, how do we then manage the population, right? How do we manage bodies of people if they have the liberty to simply do as they like? Where's the check and balance as far as having a safe environment to live in? So you can evaluate Arnold's argument for yourself, but again, it was one that was a real preoccupation for many Victorian authors. We also have just a little section in here that I find kind of interesting. One of the major concerns of the Victorian period is this notion of empire. So the British Empire at one point, the famous phrase is that the sun never sets on the British Empire. In other words, somewhere around the globe, it's 5 o'clock or noon, or the empire stretches so far, which is really kind of funny to look at. If you ever just check a map, Britain, and really London is the center of that little island, is absolutely tiny in relation to the massive geography that it controlled. You really wonder how that was possible. And there's lots of historical, questioning about how was that possible? How did it evolve that way? But certainly the notion of empire and whether it's right and what the consequences are for that kind of global control by just one very small, physically small, but also in some ways very socially small place. What were the consequences and the fallout for places in Africa or India, for example. So the notion of empire is really funny because, of course, we get it revisited in the whole Star Wars saga, which is fundamentally this question of empire and this small rebellion force continually fighting against the empire. So it's funny how these ideas recur, but in drastically different sort of pictorial form, but fundamentally the same sort of issue. I also have a little clip here from Heart of Darkness, one of the most famous late Victorian, early modern works by Joseph Conrad. The central concern is, of course, empire, and then we get that reworked in Francis Ford Coppola's more modern Apocalypse Now. So there's a couple of video clips there. So there's nothing you have to do with that aside from just sort of look at them and to think about, again, sort of continuity of concerns that are still with us or get revisited from the Victorian period. The assignment then you'll find in the Victorian era discussion board folder here. And it's not addressing a particular work per se, but what we're interested in here is to do some research on all of the various kinds of social or cultural questions that were pressing for Victorian thinkers at the time. So again, the overriding concern for the Victorian period is pace of change itself, and in some ways that's just a response to the sheer diversity of things that were going on, and that diversity is kind of what we're getting at with this discussion board / research assignment, all the diversity of various problems that writers were addressing, whether it's child labor or empire itself or prostitution, for example. So one of the points that I make in the slideshow for this week is that the Victorian era is really one of extremes. It's an extreme time in terms of propriety, social propriety, decorum, morals and correct behavior or correct public behavior. But at the same time, it's also an era that sees massive spikes in prostitution, in child labor, in urban violence, so crime. So a lot of our most famous either literary villains or actual historical villains come from the Victorian period. Think of Jack the Ripper, for example. That those are part and parcel of what's going on at during the Victorian period, as far as people moving to cities, things becoming industrialized and mechanized, people's labor being sort of co-opted for what it can be bought for, which again is something that I mentioned in the slideshow as far as old ideas about, like from Adam Smith or Thomas Hobbes, for example, 17th century thinkers are returned with such force and emphasis in the Victorian period because the conditions that sort of prompted those earlier writers to look at those problems are now themselves kind of intensified during the Victorian period. So we, in some ways, have a return to some of those most fundamental questions about the individual's relationship to society. Okay, so I'll let you get to it. A pretty interesting sort of era that we move into, because again it has some of the seeds that we can see will really take hold as far as getting into the modern period, capital M modern, and then our own contemporary period, whatever you want to call it, postmodern or the information age or the space age. We haven't quite settled on a term for our contemporary world yet, but maybe that'll be up for debate for future scholars. All right, so any questions about the midterm? Feel free to be in touch, and of course if you have questions about our continuing work, be in touch as well.